In March 2002, high in the frozen peaks of Afghanistan's Arma Mountains, U.S. forces prepared for one of the most ambitious missions of the early War on Terror, codenamed Operation Anaconda. This assault would take American and coalition troops deep into the Shah-i-Kot Valley, a place whose very name translates to Valley of Kings. The goal was simple on paper: crush what was believed to be the last stronghold of al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters. Intelligence suggested there were only a few hundred militants hiding among the rocky ridges. But as history would soon prove, those numbers were dangerously wrong. What was meant to be a short, decisive strike turned into a brutal two-week battle, a test of endurance, coordination, and survival that would become known as the bloodiest fight of the Afghan War. Only months earlier, the world had watched in horror as the 9/11 attacks unfolded. The U.S. responded swiftly with Operation Enduring Freedom, toppling the Taliban government with airstrikes and local rebel alliances. By late 2001, Kabul had fallen. Many believed the war was nearly over. But in the labyrinth of Afghan mountains, al-Qaeda and Taliban survivors had melted away, regrouping, rearming, and waiting. The failed attempt to capture Osama bin Laden during the Battle of Tora Bora still haunted U.S. commanders. Determined not to repeat that mistake, they shifted focus to the Shah-i-Kot Valley, a rugged landscape full of caves and cliffs. It had once repelled the Soviets during their occupation, and it was about to challenge the Americans just as fiercely. By early 2002, satellite images and human intelligence pointed to a concentration of enemy fighters led by local warlords, including Saif Rahman Mansour, son of a Taliban commander killed months earlier. U.S. Central Command, under General Tommy Franks, designed a massive joint operation. Around 3,000 troops from the U.S. and allied nations, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and several European forces, would converge on the valley. The strategy was classic. Afghan militia forces, led by Zia Loden, would advance into the valley from the south while U.S. and coalition troops landed in the surrounding high ground to cut off escape routes to Pakistan. Air power, including AC-130 gunships and Apache helicopters, would hammer enemy defenses. But as with many plans, reality didn't cooperate. On March 1, 2002, American SEALs were airlifted onto a nearby ridge to establish observation points. Almost immediately, they came under fire, a warning sign that al-Qaeda was better prepared than anticipated. The next morning, the main assault began. Afghan militias led the charge into the valley while U.S. task forces Hammer and Anvil moved into position. But progress was slow and chaotic. The terrain was treacherous. Vehicles bogged down in mud. Convoys lost formation. And when an AC-130 gunship mistakenly opened fire on a U.S. convoy due to a navigation glitch, several American soldiers were killed, a tragic case of friendly fire that shattered the element of surprise. Worse yet, as troops advanced, it became clear that intelligence had vastly underestimated enemy strength. Instead of 200 fighters, up to 1,000 well-armed insurgents were dug into bunkers, caves, and fortified ridgelines. They had stockpiled heavy machine guns, mortars, and anti-aircraft weapons. The Americans had walked into a trap. As Task Force Raksan troops were airlifted into the northeast corner of the valley, they came under immediate fire. The air filled with the hiss of mortars and the whistle of RPGs, Apache gunships swooped low to engage, unleashing rockets into the mountainsides. The enemy used tactics refined during the Soviet War, firing RPGs vertically so they would explode midair, showering deadly shrapnel across wide areas. 2 Apaches were hit and forced to retreat, their electronics crippled. By midday, U.S. soldiers had secured positions on the ridges but were pinned down by relentless fire. Airstrikes rained down on enemy positions as coalition snipers picked off fighters from above. Among the chaos, acts of heroism stood out. Staff Sergeant Andre Roll coordinated mortar fire under extreme pressure, earning the Bronze Star for valor. Australian SAS operators braved open fire to drag wounded Americans to safety. As night fell, an AC-130U gunship provided crucial cover, its 105mm cannon lighting up the valley floor. By dawn, the first phase of Operation Anaconda had turned the Shah-i-Kot into a battlefield of smoke, fire, and shattered rock. But the bloodiest chapter was yet to come. On March 4, a U.S. Chinook helicopter carrying Navy SEALs attempted to land on the peak of Takur Gar, a 10,000-foot mountain overlooking the valley. The team, call sign Mako 30, was to establish an overwatch position. As they descended, hidden militants unleashed RPGs, striking the helicopter midair. Petty Officer Neil Roberts was thrown from the ramp as the aircraft crash-landed miles away. What followed was one of the most harrowing rescue attempts of the war. SEALs and Air Force combat controllers fought uphill through blinding snow and gunfire to retrieve Roberts and Technical Sergeant John Chapman. Both men were mortally wounded, but their bravery became legendary. Chapman would later be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first airman to receive it since Vietnam. Ranger units arriving as backup also faced devastating losses. Caught in ambushes, several soldiers were killed before airstrikes cleared the summit. Though U.S. forces eventually secured Takur Ghar, it came at an enormous cost. The Battle of Roberts Ridge, as it became known, symbolized the chaos and sacrifice of Operation Anaconda, where poor intelligence and rugged terrain turned every mission into a fight for survival. After days of intense fighting, U.S. commanders adjusted tactics. Rather than frontal assaults, they relied more heavily on air power and precision strikes. B-52s and F-15s bombarded the valley's cave networks while ground forces conducted limited sweeps to finish off remaining resistance. Afghan militia fighters, now regrouped, joined in clearing out settlements and bunkers. By March 10, most organized resistance had collapsed. Allied troops combed the valley for intelligence, bodies, and weapons caches. Over 800 insurgents were estimated killed, though only a fraction of that number was ever confirmed. In the final days of the operation, U.S. Task Force 11 tracked a convoy suspected of carrying high-value al-Qaeda leaders attempting to flee toward Pakistan. Guided by a Predator drone, special operators ambushed the group in the mountains, destroying their vehicles and killing dozens. It was a rare moment of decisive success in a mission marked by confusion. On March 18, 2002, General Tommy Franks declared Operation Anaconda an unqualified success. Officially, U.S. forces had cleared the Shah-i-Kot Valley of insurgents and inflicted heavy losses. But behind the scenes, the story was more complicated. Reports from coalition partners painted a different picture, one of poor planning, communication breakdowns, and underestimation of the enemy. German and Australian special forces later described tense disagreements with U.S. commanders over tactics and civilian casualties. Intelligence officers questioned the accuracy of kill counts, with some suggesting that only a few dozen enemy bodies were ever recovered. Still, for the soldiers who fought there, the operation's meaning went beyond numbers. It proved that the Afghan war would not be won quickly, and that even overwhelming firepower couldn't guarantee victory in a land designed to resist invaders. Operation Anaconda marked a turning point. It was the last large-scale, conventional battle of the early Afghan war. Afterward, U.S. strategy shifted toward counterinsurgency, relying on smaller raids and targeted operations rather than mass assaults. For many veterans, the scars of Anaconda ran deep, not just physical wounds, but the memory of comrades lost in a valley half a world away. The Taliban, meanwhile, portrayed the battle as a victory, calling it the beginning of a sacred jihad against foreign occupation. Their propaganda would fuel years of insurgency to come. In truth, the outcome was mixed. The U.S. and its allies had driven al-Qaeda from one stronghold, but the enemy simply melted into another. The war was far from over, it was only evolving. Operation Anaconda was supposed to be quick. Instead, it became a brutal lesson in the realities of modern warfare, where technology meets terrain, and victory is measured in survival, not statistics. More than 20 years later, the echoes of the Shah-i-Kot Valley still haunt military strategists. It was a battle that defined the early days of America's longest war, a fight that began with confidence, and ended as a sobering reminder that even the most powerful armies can be tested by the mountains of Afghanistan.